Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another edition of the Military Aviation Museum's ongoing webinar series. We're going to be talking about one of the museum's most interesting collections this evening. It's not an aircraft collection, but rather a collection of World War I era works by a French artist, Henri Farré. I'm Keegan Chetwynd, the director of the Military Aviation Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Lichtenstein. If you've attended an air show here at the museum, you will recognize his voice. He is one of our announcers here at the show. He does a fantastic job of helping people understand what they're seeing before them in terms of historic flying demonstrations. But I also want to acknowledge that Jonathan is basically the motive force behind our annual Flying Proms show. This is our air show that combines a symphony performance and choreographed flying. Jonathan works for a significant portion of the year as a volunteer, um, developing this choreography and orchestrating everything with the Virginia Wind Symphony to deliver these phenomenal Flying Proms performances. And I know we're all eager to see that return in June of 2021, as it had to be canceled for this year owing to a lack of suitable performance spaces and practice venues. So Jonathan, I think that's probably about enough for me. Uh, are you there? Can you hear us?
Keegan, good evening. I'd like to take a moment to thank you for your generous remarks and for that warm introduction. And I'd also like to say to everyone, thank you for joining us this evening for what I hope will be an interesting and stimulating conversation, and express my personal thanks to Keegan and the Military Aviation Museum for hosting this event this evening. It's my pleasure to be with you. I regret that we were not able to get together in May for what would have been the ordinary date for Warbirds Over the Beach. We're keeping our fingers crossed we can hold that event in October of this year. So I certainly appreciate your attendance tonight, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the not too distant future for the next Warbirds Over the Beach right here at the Military Aviation Museum. Now, I do have a few words of thanks that I would like to say before we get underway with our presentation this evening. In particular, what you will get to hear and see in the course of this evening's presentation forms, at least in part, the basis for a magazine article that was published most recently in the May edition of Aviation History magazine. And I would like to say thanks to the Military Aviation Museum's Director of Operations, Mr. Mitchell Welch, for helping to facilitate the photography that was undertaken to recreate the artwork, or to capture the artwork that is on display here at the Military Aviation Museum. And I also would like to take a moment to thank Ms. Victoria Reed, the volunteer coordinator at the Military Aviation Museum, for her assistance in putting together the presentation for tonight's webinar. Another word of thanks to Dr. Lloyd DeWitt, the Chief Curator, and Irene Leash, Curator of European Art at the Chrysler Museum of Art, a local art museum here in southeastern Virginia that partnered with the Military Aviation Museum most recently for an exhibition of Farré's paintings back in November of 2018. And a word of thanks to the photographers who actually prepared these images for your delight tonight, including Mr. John Cadell and Mr. Ed Pollard. We thank them for their efforts on our behalf. And last but not least, a word of thanks to Mr. Robert Boom Powell, without whom none of this would have been possible. So my thanks to you, Bob, for helping to get this off the ground. And I hope that everybody enjoys tonight's presentation. And one last word, all of the images presented tonight are strictly for educational purposes, and they are being displayed under fair use. No copyright is implied. So without further ado, let's get the show underway. And we will introduce to you Monsieur Henri Farré. Born in Foix, France in July of 1871, French artist Henri Farré produced 175 paintings during World War I. A student of the École des Beaux-Arts, he used his canvas to record the encounters of daring men and their frail machines in the perilous skies over the Western Front. His art did more than any photograph to depict the color and movement of a new invention that would forever change the nature of warfare and the destiny of mankind. At the outbreak of war between France and Germany in August of 1914, Farré was actively pursuing a career as a portrait artist in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Determined to defend his native country against the German advance, Farré returned to France and attempted to enlist for active duty. His age at the time, which was 43, however, was sufficient to exclude him from selection for service. Undeterred, Farré constantly badgered friends with connections to the French military, ultimately paving the way for his investiture. No sooner had he reported for duty than Farré was asked to paint as well as to fight for France. The French Minister for War had directed Farré's division commander, quote, to create a group of artist painters whose duty it will be to paint certain phases of action so as to immortalize on canvas true pictures of fighting in the field, unquote. Farré was soon observing as an observer slash bombardier with a Voisin bomber squadron, Voisin being the manufacturer of the aircraft in question. He joined Escadrille VB 102. Its Voisin 3 bombers were a frequent subject of his earliest paintings from above the front lines. It would take 5 months of flying, however, before Farré could, as he put it, see vertically. Before long, he was making accurate observations of the colors of the sky at high altitude, of cloud formations, and of the earth below, as seen from a point of view few artists before him had been privileged to enjoy. The New York Times recalled that Farré had his sketch pad tied to his knee and, in the course of events, circled over the scene of action, oblivious to the shells, noting the details. He never got a scratch. As a means of raising Allied support and money for the orphaned children of France, the French government authorized the artist to take his paintings to the United States in 1918. In New York and Chicago, his efforts won him great acclaim from all walks of American society. Gustave Courbet, then art critic for the New York Herald, wrote of the exhibition, quote, wherever these pictures are shown, they will make a sensation, unquote. And in fact, the photograph that you see of Monsieur Farré on your screens right now was taken in the course of this nationwide tour. Today, Farré's paintings serve as a compelling record of the rapid advancement of military aviation during World War I. A large assortment of his artwork is today displayed at the Military Aviation Museum in Virginia Beach, along with many of the same ancient aeroplanes once depicted by Farré, some of which still occasionally take to the air. It is a fitting remembrance of the airmen who served a century ago in the first battles for mastery of the skies. And so what I'd like to do now, we have a selection of images from the Military Aviation Museum's collection of paintings that we will go through, each of which is unique and distinct in its own right and spans the duration of the First World War. Farré enlisted in 1914 and he remained in service with the French military through the end of the conflict. And as you see on your screens, he is wearing his uniform. He was not merely a civilian tasked with documenting these events. He did serve in the front lines. And so these truly do represent firsthand depictions of the action as witnessed by Farré. Although later in his career, his style would change somewhat in the sense that he took some poetic license, I guess you could say, in terms of interpreting not only what he saw, but the accounts of others as they bore witness to the horrors of the Great War. So let's move on to our second slide this evening. This is probably the most dramatic of the paintings held in the Military Aviation Museum's collection of Farré's paintings. It's obviously much larger than what you can see on your computer screen, and it's quite impressive in person. And it's wonderful to see it in this state because thanks to the partnership with the Chrysler Museum of Art, it has been cleaned and conserved professionally, and the vibrant colors that Farré committed to his canvas can now be seen quite clearly. And what you are looking at is a flight of Handley Page bombers, British heavy bombers from the First World War. The Handley Page O400, a development of the earlier O100, and that is O, the letter O, not me using O instead of zero. So the O100 was operated first by the Royal Naval Air Service and then by the newly amalgamated Royal Air Force. Painted by Farré in 1918, this scene depicts two of the lumbering giants attacking some unknown target by night, possibly in Germany or German-occupied France or Belgium. It may even be a rare depiction of action by the Independent Air Force, later the Inter-Allied Independent Air Force, which undertook coordinated bombing raids on such strategic targets as aerodromes, railways, and industrial facilities. This particular painting is remarkable because it is a night scene And you can see clearly these searchlights trying to pick out the individual aircraft, as well as the flash of flak and anti-aircraft from the ground. It's a very dramatic scene, and you can definitely get a sense of the tension in the subject and also the level of detail committed to the canvas while still maintaining what is essentially an otherwise impressionistic style. This is something that is the hallmark of Farré's paintings, and we'll explore that a little bit further with this later and somewhat more apocryphal scene. So here we can see more directly combat being joined by British and German pilots. In the foreground, we see the Bristol F2B two-seat fighter. This was a multi-use fighter that came out around 1917 in frontline service. Underappreciated by its crews initially, it didn't do so well in service, and then once crews finally figured out the advantages that it provided, they were able to bring this plane they were able to make the best use of it in combat, actually powered by a Rolls-Royce engine. And you can see clearly the evolution and refinement of Farré's style as it is demonstrated by a shift in his use of perspective. His paintings no longer depicted events strictly from the artist's point of view, as with this scene from 1918 of an embattled Bristol fighter. Farré is able to freeze the action and permit the viewer to dwell on what would have been an instant. During his tour of the United States, the New York Times remarked that Farré's works opened a completely new field of vision to the general public and stirred both the emotions and the imagination. And this compelling scene certainly does that for me. And if it's something that you've never had the benefit of seeing, I hope that it does the same for you. We can clearly see the F2B in the foreground and what looks very much like an albatross, a German albatross fighter in the upper right-hand corner of the painting as it's taking fire from the gunner and observer of the F2B. As I said, this was a two-seat fighter bomber and was one of the frontline aircraft flown by the Royal Flying Corps toward the end of the First World War and remained in service for many years afterwards, well into the 1920s. And even to this day, there remain flying examples of the Bristol fighter, and the Bristol Company, believe it or not, has survived into the present day, although in a much more limited capacity, producing bespoke sports cars as part of the Fraser-Nash conglomerate in the United Kingdom. This next work is a great departure in terms of subject and in terms of method. Most of the paintings and most of the works of art that we will see tonight were painted in oil and predominantly were painted on board, not on canvas. And so here what we see is a relatively impromptu sketch, but one that clearly had personal meaning for Henri Farré. It depicts Captain Georges Jeanmaire, one of the great aces of France from the First World War. Georges Jeanmaire was not yet 23 when he was immortalized as a hero of France. His immortality, however, came at a high price. Captain Jeanmaire, with 54 victories to his credit, vanished without trace on the morning of September the 11th, 1917, while on sortie near Paul-Capelle in Belgium. In a posthumous portrait, Farré captures the hollowness of the war-weary Jeanmaire's gaze. Inset is a cartoon depicting the ace triumphant in combat. His Spad 7, known as Vieux Charles, clearly identifiable. That translates as Old Charles. Old Charles, believe it or not, is today preserved at the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace, basically the Air and Space Museum of France, outside of Paris. This is interesting in part because the museum reopened only recently from an extensive renovation and presumably was compelled to close due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We imagine that a great many people are eager to cross the threshold of the museum to see those renovations, and so we hope that that will be the case for them, as we certainly look forward to reopening the Military Aviation Museum to you in the not too distant future. But it is remarkable that a plane of such significance and with such importance to the French has been preserved to this day, and it is true that Georges Jeanmaire's memory has been preserved in the Pantheon in Paris. I have to say that this is probably my favorite painting, although the painting of the Handley Page bombers is a close second, if not tied for first. Perhaps no other image portrays the romance of aviation in the opening stages of World War I more ably than this 1914 portrait of a Blériot 11 by Farré. The venerable 11, the same type Louis Blériot used to cross the English Channel in 1909, would serve throughout the conflict, although in an increasingly diminished capacity. In 1914, however, it was employed as an early platform for aerial reconnaissance. The dynamic quality of Farré's painting almost brings to life this forgotten moment on an aerodrome somewhere in France, especially the way in which the fumes from the engine are wafted back under the wing and over the tailplane, and we can just see the ghostly image of a man holding the plane steady in anticipation of its flight, as well as the vertical stabilizers of other Blériots in the background. This truly conveys the energy of the plane and probably the degree to which it was shaking from the engine being operated in anticipation of that long forgotten flight sometime in 1914. In 1914, reconnaissance was widely perceived as the only practical military application of the aeroplane. Vertical cameras were used from the outset of the war, but they were too heavy and bulky for the light aircraft of the day. Most early reconnaissance flights were recorded through observations or written reports. Indeed, it is likely Farré's own handwritten notes and preliminary sketches sometimes served as authoritative accounts of sorties flown. On more than one occasion, he returned to the scenes of earlier battles to sketch details of the topography he claimed to have missed or misinterpreted. Handheld cameras, such as the one wielded by this British aerial observer, were sometimes employed, but with mixed results. To achieve a satisfactory image required both a skilled pilot to maintain level flight and a capable operator who could handle the bulky camera and the heavy glass plate negatives. All belligerent nations soon learned the importance of aerial photography. By 1916, air reconnaissance was practiced regularly along the Western Front. This in turn necessitated fighter escorts and thereby drove much of the rapid progress in aeronautical engineering for the duration of the war. It is estimated that about 1/3 of all sorties flown were devoted to reconnaissance. Here, an officer receives a camera from the observer of a Salmson 2A2 with the 91st Aero Squadron of the 1st Army Observation Group with the United States Army Air Service sometime in 1918. This is a truly remarkable photograph and actually comes to us courtesy of the Smithsonian Institution and represents a unique document not only of aerial reconnaissance activities during World War I, but of the American contribution to those vital aspects of combat during the Great War. By the end of the war, both sides maintained detailed maps of the front lines derived from mosaics made up of thousands of aerial photographs. Germany alone reportedly generated 4,000 images a day in 1918. The British are known to have developed some 80,000 images in the course of a single battle. Here we see an individual piecing together photographs and assembling them into a composite image for further analysis. Since few, if any, photographs were taken of actual aerial combat during the First World War, Farré's oil paintings today represent a visually and historically significant record of French air operations. His first-hand impressions of the exciting and dangerous air exploits by men in canvas-covered crates were, for many, the only representations of their kind known to the European and American public during the First World War. And this technique of creating mosaic photographs would persist well into the Second World War, and in fact take on an even more interesting aspect by creating stereographic views, which could then provide not only an aspect view of the field of battle, but also a depth of field view, which could produce even greater levels of detail in terms of reporting. What's even more remarkable is of these thousands of photographs taken during the First and Second World War, many of them still survive. And in fact, I know for a fact in Great Britain, at Keele University, you will find an extensive archive of many of these photographs spanning the First and Second World Wars. And as was mentioned previously, many of them are on glass plate negatives. The introduction of the aeroplane into military service had been driven largely by aerial observation and later by photo reconnaissance. ultimately, very little attention would be paid to the documentation of air operations, with nearly all camera lenses focused on the persistent carnage unleashed upon the beleaguered trenches of the opposing armies. Depicted here in 1916, this Caudron G4 is engaged in a typical reconnaissance mission over the Somme battlefield. And in fact, it was the Battle of the Somme that saw some of the first truly coordinated efforts by the use of aircraft with activity on the ground. The Caudron seems a rather unlikely platform for reconnaissance, but for the time it was a very useful airplane and actually represented the evolution of an even earlier design, and that is depicted in a separate painting here. You can see clearly the lineage. The Caudron G3 of 1914, a rather slow, steadfast reconnaissance platform, was largely incapable of carrying either defensive or offensive armament. As a result, the Caudron brothers, Gaston and René, used the G3 as the basis for their more successful twin-engine G4 of 1915. Essentially, the G4 was a doubled G3 with two Rhone rotary engines flanking a crew compartment mounted between the wings. And I think I should be able to go backwards. Look at that. And there you can see clearly how similar the aircraft are, although this view is somewhat less distinct in its detail. There are actual surviving examples of G4s in museums, and if I remember correctly, the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome in upstate New York had, or still has at one time, may still have an airworthy example of a G4. They really do look insubstantial in person, and so it is remarkable to consider the risk taken by the crew and the limited ability of the aircraft to protect itself, let alone its crews. I'd say that the best explanation for it is they didn't know any better at the time. But as we can see, the evolution of aircraft, even during the First World War, was incremental and would often involve aircraft manufacturers taking advantage of pre-existing designs. And that's also something that was pursued not only in France, but also in Italy. The Caproni CA-1 of 1914-1915 featured wooden construction and a fabric-covered fuselage with wings of equal span and a distinctive twin-boom triple-rudder tail. And despite the substantial undercarriage, the forward pair of wheels was actually intended primarily to prevent the plane from nosing over on landing and on takeoff. The tail is shown here, cradled on a large dolly. Powered by three engines, two tractors, and a single pusher, and you can't see the pusher engine because it's at the back of the crew compartment. The CA-1 was equipped with either Gnome or Larone rotaries. Based on Farré's notes, we know this particular CA-1 was actually built in France under license, as it equipped a photo reconnaissance wing. Bomber wings flew Italian-built examples, and the CA-1 would spawn a whole host of multi-engine bombers built by the Caproni company, who sort of made it their hallmark, some of which were quite incredible in their size, including some triplane bombers. Not particularly practical, but boy, did they look impressive. And for the day, when you consider their wingspans approaching 100 feet or more, that these were equivalent in some respects to the largest bombers of the Second World War. And these planes built almost entirely of wood and canvas, as opposed to the all-metal designs of some 30 years later. But for the Caproni company, it all started with the CA-1 with its rotary engines of 1914 and 1915. The Fokker Scourge of 1915-1916 paralleled similar crises confronting French and British forces on the ground. Not until the advent of more capable aircraft, such as the Nieuport 11 Bebe and the Airco DH-2, did the Allies possess equipment equal to the Fokker Eindeckers and their synchronized machine guns. Among Farré's depictions of the sky fighters of France in their Spads, Voisins, and Nieuports, this particular work from 1916 represents the persistent hope for a French victory over Germany. And what we're actually seeing here is a rather dramatic and heartrending moment. Two planes converging on the field of battle in the skies over France, presumably. We have a Nieuport fighter, most likely an 11 or possibly a Nieuport 12. It's not particularly clear, but based on the date, it's more than likely a Nieuport 11. And we see a Fokker Eindecker, probably an E3, going down in flames having been bested in combat. And what's even more telling is the fact that we see the pilot of the Eindecker plunging from his burning cockpit. Fire was a serious problem in combat in the First World War and remains a serious problem for all aviators who put themselves and their equipment in the front lines. But during World War I, there was no armor protection, there were no self-sealing fuel tanks, and more importantly, there were no parachutes. And parachutes did not go into wide distribution amongst air crews until the very end of the war, and they only were in service really with German air forces. Balloonists who served in observation balloons would receive parachutes, but the pilots, and particularly those in the French and British air forces, did not have the benefit of parachutes, in part because they were very bulky and impractical. Consider the size of a cockpit of a World War I aircraft. There wasn't much room allowed for anything extra. And so the idea of sitting on a parachute just didn't figure into things. And even the parachutes used by the balloonists were ungainly affairs that were sort of strapped to the side of the basket and would deploy only with the gravity, with the balloonist, with the observer falling out of the basket and literally his weight pulling the parachute free of its container. Very cumbersome and therefore not conducive to use with aircraft of this type. The general consensus amongst the British High Command was that parachutes were not issued because they felt it would encourage unacceptable behavior. That's a nice way of saying they were afraid that it would encourage cowardice and that pilots and their crews would not be sufficiently encouraged to prosecute the war to its fullest. So unfortunately, many men met their ends in crashes, deaths that otherwise could have been avoided had they been issued with parachutes. And fire, as I said, was something that was always in the minds of air crews. In fact, Mick Mannock, one of the prominent pilots of the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War, swore that he would rather take his own life than burn. And well, he unfortunately did not survive the war, but no one can say whether or not he resorted to using the sidearm that he always took with him when he flew. During the First World War, training in aerial warfare was still a novelty whose inventiveness Farré sought to capture in this scene from 1917. In a depiction of the French aerial gunnery school at Cazaux in the Gironde department of Nouvelle-Aquitaine, the painting shows a military motorboat on Arrechon Bay as it tows a long cable lofted skyward by a large kite. Colorful balloons, possibly filled with hydrogen, are tied at regular intervals along the length of the rope to serve as targets for the student gunners. The casual aspect of this otherwise playful endeavor contrasts starkly with the grim purpose for which the exercise was intended. It also belies the comparatively slow pace with which aerial combat was prosecuted at the time. Cazaux Air Base was established in 1914 and today endures as Base Aérienne 120. It still serves mainly for the training of French fighter pilots and facilitates gunnery training over the bay, gunnery training over the Bay of Biscay. It's truly remarkable that we're now actually at 106 years later, and 103 years since this particular scene was painted, that the facility for aerial gunnery that was created in France at Cazaux is still in use today for the exact same purpose, although I'm sure they're not using such lovely balloons filled with hydrogen for the purpose. In fact, I know in the United States, aerial tactics involve the use of drones, except that when I say drone, I actually mean a remotely piloted fighter aircraft, usually a surplus fighter aircraft. And this mission is undertaken with the United States Air Force at AMARC, which is the recovery facility and reclamation facility for surplus aircraft in Arizona, just outside of Tucson. It's actually in Pima, Arizona. And what they do is they convert disused aircraft like F-4 Phantoms. Prior to that, they were using F-106s and convert them so that they can be operated remotely and basically shot out of the sky with air-to-air missiles. Here, obviously, we would have witnessed the use of Lewis guns or Maxim machine guns to attack the targets. The color, I'm sure, helped to make them more visible. The use of hydrogen gas perhaps made it more clear whether or not they had actually hit their target. Helium in lighter than air applications was not in regular or widespread use anywhere in the world until after World War I, and even then it was limited almost exclusively to the United States, who had a virtual monopoly on the gas and its production. So for any lighter than air application, whether it be in an airship or something like this gunnery range, almost certainly hydrogen would have been used, and we can even see that the degree to which the balloons were attached to their cable was not perhaps the best, because some of the balloons have actually floated away and you can see them in the distance. I should also point out the use of a kite, a static kite for this kind of an application was not unusual and was something that had seen a lot of experimentation in the late 19th century and even into the early 20th century. Otto Lilienthal, the great German glider pilot, was somebody who certainly made use of static kites in his experiments, and also Alexander Graham Bell explored a lot of novelty kites for various applications in the early 20th century. And there were even so-called man-carrying kites that were intended to bring a man up high enough that he could observe the enemy in the field. Well, here, there's no man strapped to that kite that I can see, but it's certainly an effective means of bringing this tow cable into the sky to provide an interesting target for trainee pilots of circa 1917. And we can also see the military crewmen probably enjoying a little bit of relaxation on Arrachon Bay as the training is underway. If there is one constant in combat, it is that there is always a lot of time spent waiting for the next engagement, and Farré used this time to good advantage and applied himself to painting still life portraits of the different aircraft that surrounded him. His initial posting in 1914 was to one of the first dedicated bomber escadrilles that operated the Voisin 3. The Voisin's power came from its unusual liquid-cooled Salmson radial engine, the radiators for which can actually be seen clearly behind the cockpit. And those are the sort of gold-colored bricks that you see behind the crew compartment. And this, of course, is a Voisin 3. These aircraft featured prominently in some of Farré's earliest paintings, and this is perhaps the best portrait that he did produce, although some of them are a bit more dramatic, including a very impressive night scene. And the plane was built by the Voisin Company, which was another family-owned firm, two brothers, in fact, and they later went on to produce a very remarkable motor vehicle, a motor car, a very exclusive car, a very luxurious car called the Avion Voisin. Now, if any of you are familiar with the Dirk Pitt novels, the author of which just passed away recently, and he himself was a great collector of antique automobiles, that the Avion Voisin figured prominently in one of those novels, and it's fascinating to look at those automobiles and then look at the Voisin 3, one of the earliest aircraft produced by the company. And believe it or not, and it isn't just because the plane has four wheels, it's really interesting that you can see a connection in terms of the styling of the car with the design of the aircraft. And that, in fact, was the intent of the Voisin brothers, was to apply the lessons learned in their manufacture of aircraft during the First World War and apply aerodynamic principles to the design, manufacturing, and sale of a practical, although it really didn't turn out to be particularly practical and affordable, and it certainly didn't turn out to be affordable automobile. And they would not be the only ones to attempt this. In fact, Edmund Rumpler, who manufactured some of the Taube aircraft during World War I for Germany and Austria, very distinctive airplanes that have the look of a bird. You'll see them in planes from pictures from about 1914, 1915, used mostly for aerial reconnaissance in a capacity not unlike the Blériot 11. And Edmund Rumpler, who made a lot of those planes and many others for Germany and Austria, after the war attempted to create a very interesting automobile called the Tropfenwagen. It was not commercially successful. They were sold mostly as taxis in Berlin, and the filmmaker Fritz Lang basically made a bonfire of them when he was making his movie Metropolis. But it is interesting to see the way in which the technology that was developed in such a rapid pace during World War I was later applied to other industries. And it can be said without fear of contradiction that the automobile and the aeroplane have been inexorably intertwined ever since. So I find it fascinating that here, a plane that was at the beginning of World War I and served as sort of the cradle for Farré's creativeness in his earliest sorties over the front lines, serves as this very distinctive subject and certainly the harbinger of things to come, both with regards to the development of aerospace engineering, automotive technology, and many of the things that we take for granted today. So I hope that you have enjoyed this look at some of the paintings. We've only explored about a dozen of them in the last 40 minutes or so, but there are many more to be seen here at the Military Aviation Museum, and if, as Keegan says, we are able to reopen on Friday of this week, then I would certainly encourage you at your convenience to come down to the museum and take a look through the entire gallery. Many more compelling scenes, many more interesting insights into aircraft and air operations during the First World War, as documented by Monsieur Henri Farré with his palette and his brush and his canvas. And again, on display here at the Military Aviation Museum. If you are interested in other paintings by Monsieur Farré, you'll find them on display at the Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. They have a similarly large collection. And if you would really like to delve deeper into this subject, well, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the May edition of Aviation History magazine, or really look at Sky Fighters of France, the autobiography of Henri Farré. You will find reproduction copies available on Amazon and through other book dealers. I wouldn't bet on finding a first edition, but it is still available. And it does tell in much greater detail the story of Monsieur Farré himself, his exploits on the front lines, and his achievements as one of the most distinctive painters and artists to come out of World War I, and certainly one of the first artists to depict scenes of aerial combat from the air and based on firsthand impressions. So thank you very much for your time.
Jonathan, thank you for your time and your examination of these pieces with us this evening. We're going to give people a couple minutes to enter their questions into the question window, but we have had some that have already arrived. Jonathan, could you tell us a little bit more about what Farré did in the French Air Force? He was a military crew member assigned a role, and he wasn't just there to paint paintings.
That is absolutely correct, Keegan. The role fulfilled by Monsieur Farré was military first, artistic second. He served as an observateur bombardier, that is, an observer bombardier, and flying in a plane like the Voisin 3 that you can see on your screen right now, he essentially would have been tasked with observing action on the ground, and he may also have been called upon to defend the airplane. Consider that this plane is very insubstantial, but it also would have carried a bomb load. And on one particular occasion, one of the more harrowing occasions, Monsieur Farré was called upon to save the airplane from a fate that we need not speculate upon, which is that one of the bombs had actually become hung up in the undercarriage. And the fuse was primed, and the bomb was live, and the plane was coming in for a landing. It certainly wasn't going to be a smooth one, and Monsieur Farré had to lean over the edge of the cockpit with his knife and cut away the bracing wires that were causing the bomb to be hung up, and therefore to release it before they could land. He might also have been compelled to operate the machine gun in defense of the aircraft. There were no synchronized machine guns available at this early juncture in the First World War, and therefore he would have had to operate the gun by standing up in the cockpit and aiming above the wing, below the wing, around the pilot, around the propeller, in any way to avoid shooting up his own aircraft as much as he might have been attempting to damage the plane being flown by the aggressor. So it was a lot more than just sitting back and enjoying the breeze and enjoying the scenery. He did have a military role to fulfill while operating in theater.
Thank you for that explanation, Jonathan. Obviously, Farré had a great deal of talent. He did survive World War I. What did he go on to do following the war?
Not a lot. The war was something I think that affected him deeply, as it did the many millions of men who went into the trenches. Although Farré himself did not serve on the ground, that doesn't mean that he was immune from the gravity of what it was that he had participated in. he came to the United States in 1918, as I said, to conduct a fundraising tour to raise money for the orphans of French pilots who had met their end in combat. And that experience made him enamored of the United States. And he did not actually return to France. Instead, he remained in the United States and he went on to an entirely new life here. In fact, he married a woman in Chicago who had a dress shop. She was a very accomplished woman in the fashion industry in Chicago at the time and was directly involved in the promotion of French fashion in the United States. So we can imagine that she was also fluent in the language, which made things, I'm sure, much easier for Monsieur Farré. And it was sort of a marriage, a September marriage, and so they spent the remainder of their lives together. Monsieur Farré actually passed away in Chicago in October of 1934 at the age of 63, and it's been observed that for someone of his skill, there more than likely would have been no place for such an artist on the front lines of the Second World War, which would ignite just 5 years later. Although, of course, plenty of art, distinctive art, did come out of that conflict, not quite of the same nature as that produced by Monsieur Farré. He did paint some scenes, mostly bucolic in the post-war years, and he also liked football. And he decided that he would capture scenes at Veterans Memorial Stadium in Chicago. But besides that, he did not revisit the subject of aviation from World War I, except in very rare instances. And I think he rather tried to move on from that aspect of his life, although these are the works of art for which he is still most well known.
Jonathan, you mentioned the role of art in World War II. We recently had a presenter speak about the subject who described artists who were in a situation of begging, borrowing, stealing where possible the supplies necessary to create their pieces. Was that true of Farré's experience, or was he furnished with all the necessary tools to be able to produce these paintings?
The more things change, the more they stay the same. And Monsieur Farré certainly experienced similar conditions. In fact, improvised is the best word that I would use for most of the paintings that we have seen on display in the course of tonight's presentation. I'll backtrack a little bit through the slideshow, if I may, if only to be able to render one particular example. We'll stop here at the cadran. So this is painted on board, not on canvas. And that was because it was material that was readily available around the aerodrome. Generally speaking, as Farré described it in his own memoir, he would come back from a flight and he would immediately, based on his sketches, run to the corner of the hangar where he had set up a sort of impromptu studio, is not even how I would describe it, just a place where he could work. And it was generally just an oil drum or some other flat surface, and then he would have a board ready and his palette with his paints that I'm sure he kept under cover to prevent them from hardening in the sun, that he would bring those out, and then he would prop up the board that he had prepared previously on the drum against the wall of the hangar. And this hangar might not even itself have been made out of wood. It might have been just sheet canvas over a frame. And that is how he would paint, out in the open. There was not some wonderful, pristine studio. And so the nature of these paintings is truly improvised, as was the setting in which they were created. He made do with what he had, with the materials that were available. And it's also probably one of the reasons why these paintings have endured, that the board has provided an easier surface for the oil paint. I'm not an expert on these things, but they've certainly proved to be very hardy, both in terms of transport and in terms of time. And it was a rugged setting in which they were created, and they have been transported, I would say, somewhat roughly in their time. But we're very grateful that they have endured, and that Monsieur Farré's inventiveness and resourcefulness enabled him to produce such compelling images from the war.
Jonathan, you mentioned that Farré himself traveled the United States with this collection of pieces, hosting gallery shows and so on, giving many people their first real glimpse of what this new type of war looked like. How did that touring collection become fragmented to end up with institutions like our own, as well as the National Museum of the United States Air Force, and as you mentioned, even the Smithsonian?
Well, we have to give credit to the galleries, and that is that their interest is not only in promoting art and promoting the artists who create it, but also to make money. And ultimately, what happened was, as far as I can understand it, the paintings went into galleries that participated in this national tour in 1918. And it did travel as an exhibit. And ultimately, it was divided among different galleries. And then ultimately, when the war ended, and when Monsieur Farré decided to remain in the United States, I can only imagine that they were on consignment to these galleries, although it's a question of ownership. When we consider Farré's original mandate came from the government of France, it's interesting to question who had title to the artwork at the time. And it may simply be that because they were here with Farré, they reverted to his control, and therefore it was at his uh, discretion how they were disposed of. There certainly are paintings that remain in collections in France and can be seen on display in prominent museums. So the body of work that he created is not limited exclusively to the United States, although this, as I said, is where he spent his remaining years, uh, but it is truly an international collection, and its dispersal is represented mostly by the fact that he remained in the United States after the war. Therefore, the paintings did not travel back with him to France, and so it remained to the local galleries where they had been exhibited to dispose of them. And we may imagine that Monsieur Farré profited by that to some extent. And we are pleased that the museum's collection has remained intact, as have most of the others, and therefore they aren't, although there are images in private collections, they are still largely together as they have been for over a century now. And that's truly remarkable. And it's even more remarkable that they are here in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where they can be observed 7 days a week instead of being hidden in a private collection where they would otherwise be unavailable to the general public.
Naturally, we extend a debt of gratitude to the museum's founder and the donor of these pieces, Jerry Yegan, who who has allowed them to be displayed in such a way that it's almost reminiscent of that traveling show. Having so many together in one place allows people to kind of immerse themselves and gain a deeper understanding of that period of human conflict. Jonathan, can you talk a little bit about the etchings that are in the collection? You mentioned the sketches earlier, and please feel free to elaborate more on the sketch pieces also. But there are a number of etchings represented in the Faré exhibit.
That is correct. Etching is an art form. Well, we can say that Rembrandt practiced etching. It's a very delicate art form and one that is largely underappreciated today. And it's especially difficult because here at the museum, we do have sketches such as the one on your screen right now depicting the late Georges Jeanmaire. Um, some of the other portraits that are on display include members of the French military establishment, and I believe we actually have one of the sketches of a football player that I mentioned previously regarding um, his Monsieur Farré's attendance at the Veteran Memorial Stadium in Chicago. And so the etchings themselves represent and depict scenes similar to those that we have observed in the paintings. Some of them are landscapes, some of them are of aircraft in flight, several of them are of individuals such as Monsieur Guinemer, and it was a way for the artwork to be reproduced. We can see with this particular sketch, it is actually, uh, I believe if I'm looking at it correctly, it is rendered from an etching, but it has been signed by Farré himself. And he has been able to render as an etching this, again, seemingly impromptu sketch. It's been crafted meticulously, most likely from a photograph of Guinemer, the depiction of the SPAD 7, more than likely the fact that the plane itself was so well known. Guinemer was the darling of the French newspapers, and so his name and everything about him had been publicized widely at the time. So the ability to secure an image representing Guinemer with his decorations in his flight suit, such as he is depicted here, and even with Vieux Charles in the lower right-hand corner, Old Charles, the SPAD 7 seen clearly. These images would not have been difficult to find. But in terms of producing the etching, most of the reputable artists of the day would have done so, especially if the intention was for the artwork to be reproduced in large numbers, or even in a limited quantity and then sold. But as we can see here, this particular example, not only was the etching plate itself signed, that it was also signed as a print. It is also possible that the etching was created by an acid etching process from an original drawing, and that therefore Monsieur Farré did not produce the etching directly on the copper plate, but it was by an acid etching process um, using perhaps a photo reproduction of an original drawing. Etching has sort of fallen out of favor today. It's a complicated process, but it was, as I said, something that would have been used extensively to reproduce, to mass produce images by well-known artists, certainly at the time.
Thank you for that explanation. Can you talk a little bit more about the use of light? I think we all saw that searchlight piercing up through the dark sky earlier in the presentation, and realized just how incredibly powerful that piece is with its subtle contrasting distinctions and so on. Can you talk a little bit more about how Farré utilized light in his works?
I'd be glad to, and I'll switch back to the painting of the Handley Page bombers. We know that Farré attended the Beaux-Arts school in Paris, and he was of the Impressionistic tradition. So we're thinking about people like Manet and Monet and their use of light and shadow and color and their suggestion of movement and their suggestion of form. And therefore, although we can see distinctly and clearly in this very dramatic image the fuselage and the wings of the Handley Page bombers, the the depth of field is also obvious. We talked about the way in which Farré mastered that three-dimensional aspect of his paintings, because he wasn't just viewing things at ground level. He was looking at them from his viewpoint in the cockpit and above and below, to the left and to the right, truly in three dimensions, while also moving through space. So he's literally capturing the movement of space and time. So if you wanted to get clever about it, you could say this is a four-dimensional painting. But the way in which the searchlight literally bisects the image and seems to pierce the image of the Handley Page, or the eruption of flak, the explosion that's taking place beneath the aircraft, despite their size and despite their post-war application as airliners, these large, ponderous airplanes were very slow and made incredibly easy targets, and therefore would have been at great risk in this particular scene. We can see bursts of flak on the left-hand side. We can see the cauldron of flame boiling up from the ground below. And it really does give a sense of the dynamic nature of this painting, because the planes not only are passing through a scene of carnage, they're wreaking carnage as they go. They are creating the explosion below them. They are creating their own light that illuminates them, besides the harsh light being created by what I imagine is an arc light in the spotlights below from the German anti-aircraft batteries. This is a dangerous scene, and it's dangerous not only for the air crews, who you can also see clearly if you look very closely. I think I may be able to point this out, so let me see if I can. With this tool on the screen, if you look very closely, you can see the crewmen on the back of the fuselage of the Handley Page as they fire their machine guns into the firestorm below. We can also see very indistinctly crewmen in the forward portion of the aircraft, hunkered down, bending over what is probably a primitive bomb site, or just looking out to see whether or not their mission has been effective. As I said, this is a dangerous scene, and the light, as I said, is being created not only by the searchlights and the anti-aircraft guns, but also by the bombs that are being dropped by the Handley Pages, whether, as I said earlier, in German-occupied France or over German-occupied Belgium, or possibly even Germany itself.
Jonathan, you described the sort of profound way in which Farré captures the dimensions of aerial combat. That's quite distinct, and it's a new thing that emerges during the war because of this kind of combat. Has your research revealed any inkling of how people responded to seeing these for the first time when they were exhibited?
Based on the newspaper accounts and some of the comments that have been made by art critics, generally speaking, people were stunned. And again, you look at a scene like this one. This, as I said, is one of the most dramatic that we have. But let's go to something that's perhaps a little more easy on the eyes. Back to the portrait of the Blériot 11. No one that I've seen who has beheld this image hasn't picked up on the photorealism. Well, no, that's not correct. That is not an accurate use of the word. What it really does is it places you in the middle of action. And it's 103 years later, and I still feel the breeze. I still feel the exhaust fumes wafting. I can still see the man holding the aft end of the fuselage of the Blériot 11. Now, maybe my impression is colored by the fact that the Military Aviation Museum's own collection holds an exquisite replica of a Blériot 11A, which is a militarized version of the Blériot 11, and in fact may very well be what we're looking at here, a sort of two-seat version that was used extensively in the opening stages of World War I by the French Air Force. And I have witnessed that plane being taxied up and down our runway here at the Military Aviation Museum. I have witnessed it being flown on brief hops down our runway. And all I can say is to see this painting and to see that plane in person, they are one and the same. And so imagining people from 100 years ago looking at this in a gallery, people who may never have seen an airplane in their lives, who may never have seen an airplane fly, let alone seen one on static display, this is better than television. And no one had ever heard of television in 1918. So my apologies to Logie Baird and to Philo T. Farnsworth, but the fact is that this was new in more ways than one, because not only was it a new subject for art, it was the opportunity for people to see a new kind of technology that hadn't even reached them yet. And it might be another 10 years before the average person who could have seen this in a gallery might have the opportunity to see an airplane in person, let alone take a flight in one. We hear a lot about the barnstorming of the post-war era. Well, if this is 1914, that's still 6 to 8 to 10 years away for most people in mid-America at that time. So really, I think that the average person and the impressions given by the critics of the era suggest that the average person would have been enthralled by images of this kind, and it would have stirred their imaginations. And it certainly fed in to the kind of boys fiction that was popular at the time. You can go through any number of catalogs and you'll find dozens of books talking about, oh, the Boy Scouts in the air and the Boy Scouts doing this with aerial combat, and any kind of boys novel, boys magazine from the era, any kind of general children's fiction. It wasn't just for boys, that it was heavily focused on aviation as a subject. But even then, there weren't a lot of illustrations. And to see this in color, to see such dynamism on a canvas or on a board, on a wall in a gallery, I really think would have captured people's imaginations.
Jonathan, can you speak to the relative size of these pieces? It's difficult for those who haven't had the opportunity to visit to grasp the range and variety of the sizes of these original paintings.
Certainly, the painting of the Blériot 11 that you see in front of you right now is quite small. In fact, it's really not much bigger than the average laptop computer. And it's really even smaller because there is a border and a frame. So it's about the size of an oversized envelope. Now, if we look at something more impressive, we'll go back to the Bristol fighter. Now this is more what we think of when we think of a painting in a gallery. It's about the size of maybe a 25-inch television. maybe a 25-inch 4:3 ratio television screen. So this is a more substantial work, as is the painting of the Handley Page bombers. But the majority of the paintings, the Blériot, now this is also a large painting. The painting of the Caudron bomber is, well, let's just say it would be about the size of one half of an average bedroom window. So if you have double hung windows in your house or a double hung window in your living room, this is the size of one pane, one frame in a double hung window. But the rest of them, like the Caudron G3, the Caproni bomber, even this one of the gunnery school at Cazaux, and certainly this one of the Voisin, these are all very small. So it really gives you a sense of that impromptu nature of the paintings, that Farré would just probably have had a stack of these boards that he had put by to use for painting, and he would just grab one. They were literally something you could pick up in your hand very easily, and they weigh nothing. They are featherweight. I can say that because having participated in the process of documenting these for publication, they really weigh nothing. So very small, very diminutive, and so we're showing them to great advantage in this forum, but generally speaking, very small paintings.
As we look at works like the G3 and the Caproni bomber, you can see that there's almost a degree of translucency in the skin of the airplanes that's reflected there. That's an intense amount of attention to detail that we see kind of across Farré's pieces. Approximately how long did it take him to create a piece? Have you got any indication of that from your research?
I'm afraid I don't, but we can only imagine that for paintings such as this one, with the Voisin that we know were painted at the aerodrome, probably not a lot of time. For paintings like the Handley Page bomber scene, it's interesting because we know for a fact that Henri Farré participated in some of the earliest night raids carried out by the French Air Force. These raids were not successful, not strictly from a military perspective, but because the planes were not well suited. And in fact, they were flying planes like this Voisin 3. This plane is painted entirely white. Well, this may have been good for daylight operations, but at night they reflected the searchlights brilliantly. It was very effective. Uh, Imagine going out on the snow. Well, you have to wear sunglasses when you ski because it's like a mirror. And that's exactly what these planes were. They acted like a mirror in flight at night with searchlights trained on them. Well, and so that speaks to the nature of the translucency that you commented on previously. When you consider the time taken to create these portraits, I think that a scene like the one involving the Handley Page bombers, and particularly the scene with the F2B fighter, the Bristol fighter, those would have originated from a sketch, either from firsthand experience, or in the case of the F2B, I am almost certain that it came from an account uh, provided by someone else, because that is activity in which Farré more than likely could not have participated. It's also stepping out of the cockpit. You are witnessing it as if through the lens of a camera from another aircraft. It's not the field of view of the painter in the cockpit. And you see clearly, if we look through the paintings, back to this of the Caudron, sorry, of the Caudron over the Somme battlefield. Well, you can imagine he's in the cockpit looking out, and this is what the Caudron looks like from the cockpit of his airplane. But then if we go here, this is as if somebody is literally standing in space, watching the action in front of them, almost as if they're stepping into a virtual reality experience that we might have with a computer today. This is not realistic in the sense that this is more than likely not something that Farré could have witnessed firsthand, and it is also not something that he necessarily would have participated in, because this is British action that he more than likely couldn't have ridden along to observe. So somebody had to recount this to him, and therefore he could afford to make a sketch based on an anecdote, based on a sortie described to him in great detail, and then reproduce it as the painting. So I think it depended on the style and the nature of the particular scene, how much time he dedicated to its recreation when he was able to put it on canvas. And if I remember correctly, the Handley Page bomber scene is on canvas, whereas, as I said, many of the others are on board. So we imagine that that may have figured into how long it took him to create the image.
Well, Jonathan, that brings us to the end of this evening's questions. Thank you so much for the time you've spent with us this evening and for sharing this incredible collection and for the work that you've done researching the collection that is on display here at the museum.
Thank you very much, Keegan. It's been my distinct pleasure. I thank everyone who's joined us this evening, and I do hope that we'll have the opportunity of meeting again sometime soon here at the Military Aviation Museum. Don't forget to mark your calendars. Warbirds Over the Beach will be postponed, but it's supposed to be with us this year in October, and I look forward to seeing all of you on that occasion.
Just to echo Jonathan's sentiments, Warbirds Over the Beach has been rescheduled for October 2nd through 4th. Tickets are available on sale now. We do anticipate holding the show. We're very much looking forward to it. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.